Hello folks, and welcome to another Darktable Landscapes video. In this one I'm going to do just some general processing, maybe touching on things in a bit more detail, and in reference to people who are maybe looking at leaving Lightroom in favour of Darktable and looking to see how they can kind of translate their workflow from Lightroom to Darktable. So let's get going on this image. One of Lightroom's strengths is its simplicity. You can just kind of make your way down the right hand side tool palette, adjusting as you go. By the time you've got to the end, you've got a complete image. Darktable is slightly more technical and perhaps slightly different in that regard. It's not really a true Lightroom replacement, kind of just a free version of it essentially. It is its own thing, and it's evolved in a different way. So there's a lot more kind of technical image processing terms and things going on. And really it's an exercise in kind of knowing what to adjust and what you can leave alone when you're first starting out with Darktable. And the first thing that is the main difference is that we don't have this nice, neat top to bottom flow that you have in Lightroom. Instead, we have lots of modules, and in fact, the image pipeline, how the RAW processor starts with raw data from your camera sensor and outputs it to a final image, start to the bottom and works its way up. So we have the raw black-white point, it works its way through the basics, and it comes out with an output to color profile, rather, sRGB, which is how most images are displayed kind of online, for example. So I will try and go through a workflow that's roughly analogous to working our way down through the Lightroom controls, and hopefully you should see similar results to what you can get from Lightroom as well in terms of what you're familiar with. So normally the first thing you'll see in Lightroom is the crop. In Darktable, this is its own separate module, as pretty much everything is. It's built from lots of modules being put in the pipeline. So the way I normally work is by typing in the search bar up here and then turning on the control. Making any change in the controls will also turn on the module. So here's my crop. It's fairly standard. We can change things like the color of the overlay, if you want gray or red or anything else. Maybe cyan for better contrast in this one. You can change your guidelines in here, so golden spiral, much like Lightroom as well. Rule of thirds is obviously the most common and probably the most useful. And then you can just click on either a corner or an edge and drag away. So I'm going to emphasize the kind of linear nature of this reflection in this shot for by adjusting to make it a little more kind of widescreen, if you like. There we go. And you can go back to all the modules you have turned on by clicking this icon here. Next we'll go to white balance. So white balance, you can see there is a white balance module already here. Generally we don't touch that. That's kind of the basic input white balance. And then what we use for white balance in Darktable is the color calibration module. Now, as with most modules in Darktable, they look a lot more complicated than they need to be. And I'll close that area color mapping down there for just to make it even simpler. So quite often it's an exercise in just kind of doing what you need to, and rather than digging in and adjusting everything here. So for the most part, setting white balance in Darktable consists of clicking this eyedropper. And if I zoom back out, you'll see that it's drawn a box on the image. And this is the area that Darktable is looking at for kind of an average color to set the white balance on. You can click and drag in here, much like the eyedropper tool in Lightroom, to define the area that Darktable is looking at. So, so if there's a particularly neutral area you want, for example, this fog, you can select that. If you want to go back to your kind of as shot, the white balance that your camera decided, you can go to illuminant here and choose as shot in camera, and then it will go back to the default. And you can also choose different illuminants, like for example daylight, and then you can change the color temperature with this slider here. For the most part, the automatic setting is pretty good, and then you can further adjust it with the chroma slider here if you feel it's maybe gone a bit too warm or a bit too cool. But for now, I think I'm pretty happy with that for my image here. So now we'll go on to Sigmoid, which is the tone mapping module. In other words, that's how the raw file, all the data in the raw file, the brightness data, is translated from the camera raw data to the display. So it kind of maps the data from the raw data to something that can be displayed on the screen. And here we can do basic level contrast adjustments. So if I increase the contrast, you can see that my histogram up here is starting to stretch as the tones are distributed more evenly across the histogram. We can skew that left and right to adjust where they fall. And we can also do things like, if we want to do some basic kind of crushing of blacks, we can raise our target black point and likewise our target white point. So this is roughly analogous to the tone curve module in Lightroom, the tone curve controls, if you like, which is Lightroom's tone mapper. So some basic adjustment here, normally maybe adding a bit of contrast, adjusting the skew slightly. If you've got some blacks you want to crush, you can do that here. There are other ways as well, but this is generally good enough for the most basic level. So normally in Lightroom now you're looking at basic exposure adjustment and contrast adjustment. In Darktable we have a separate exposure module. If you've used, say, in-camera exposure compensation, that will often pick that up and turn that on for you, kind of compensate for it. So in this shot, evidently I had 2/3 of a stop exposure compensation down to avoid clipping any highlights. You can turn that off and on with that check mark. And indeed, I think this is probably a little too bright for my liking because we're starting to lose some of the detail in these trees up here. So I may just drop that down just a touch. What I'd like to do is kind of really boost the light and the color in these trees that are catching the sun that's rising over the hill to the left of this. So that's our exposure. And then you have a number of ways of affecting contrast. Darktable has kind of evolved over the years and has had modules added and taken away. A relatively new module is called Color Balance RGB. So I normally just type in RGB in my search box and go for Color Balance RGB. So again, more controls than you probably really need to start with. So I will go over what my basic kind of workflow is for going through Color Balance RGB, and we can maybe explore some more detail in other videos. We'll up the vibrance, which is more or less analogous to Lightroom's vibrance slider. We can do some further contrast. I don't want to do too much in this particular image, I don't think. And then we have linear chroma grading, which is kind of overall chroma, and perceptual saturation grading. So the difference between chroma and saturation is chroma can adjust the intensity of colors without affecting the brightness, whereas saturation can affect the brightness. Normally I would leave linear chroma grading alone. If you want some general kind of saturation boost, you can see I've already cranked it up there. You can use that. And you can affect each channel in terms of shadows, midtones and highlights separately as well. So if you just wanted to really intensify your shadows or desat your shadows, you can do that separately. What I normally do is what I call stepped perceptual saturation grading. So the way our brains and eyes work is that we perceive naturally more saturation in the shadows than in the highlights of whatever we're looking at. So I normally reflect that in these settings here. I increase the shadows a little bit, I increase the midtones less, and I just added maybe a touch to the highlights, and that generally gives a more natural result. And then we have brilliance grading, which is essentially roughly analogous to brightness. It's probably more technical than that, but for now it's good enough. And here we can affect the individual brightness of the separate areas of exposure. So this is a good way of increasing contrast with quite fine-grained control, more fine-grained than just a contrast slider, for example. So I'll drop the shadows slightly. I will boost highlights a bit because I want this fog to kind of glow. And then midtones, let's see what gives us the nicest effect. I'm going to drop midtones a little bit because we're getting some nice effects in the trees when I adjust midtones here. So if I zoom back out, you can see that the trees are starting to come through if I drop those midtones, so that's fine. Okay, so making our way down our imaginary Lightroom controls, now we will go for clarity and texture. So there's no clarity and texture tool by that name in Darktable, but essentially what those tools do is adjust local contrast in different ways, and we have lots of tools for that in Darktable. And so the one that we normally use is called the Contrast Equalizer. So again, I'll go to my search bar up here and type that in, and here it is. And I'll just turn it on. And let me zoom in on that control for you. So let's do clarity first. Clarity is just a general boost of local contrast across the whole range of tones in the image. And by default, this tool, you can see that this circle has kind of an area of influence. If I drag things up and down, you can see on the left how the image changes. I'm just affecting these middle values. You can double click again to reset that curve. On the left hand side, we're affecting kind of large scale features, if you like, and on the right we're affecting small scale features, fine details in other words. But for clarity, we want to affect this uniformly, and the way we can do that is by simply rolling our mouse wheel down, and you can see that the area of influence circle is getting bigger. It's still there, it's just gone off the edge of the controls. Okay, so once you've done that, put your mouse roughly in the center and just lift the whole curve to increase clarity, or drop the curve to decrease clarity. Okay, and again, double click to reset. So if I zoom back out, we'll see how this affects the whole image. So we're adding clarity now. Of course, it's very easy, just as in Lightroom, to really overcook it and make your image look terrible. So a subtle change, kind of a couple of pixels either side of the 0 point is the key quite often. Now in this particular image, because it's misty, I don't want to actually add clarity. I think I'd rather just remove some. So I'm going to drop it very slightly. And with any module in Lightroom, we can see the difference quickly between what we've done and what was there before by simply clicking this power button here next to the module. So we can turn it off and on, off and on. So we've made our image a little bit more misty. That's fine for me. Now I'm going to use another instance of this in a moment. So to stay organized, I like to rename my modules, or give them a label rather. So if you hold Control or Command on the Mac and click, then you can type in a name. So I'll call this one Clarity. Now I want to make a new instance of this, so I can use the same tool again. There's a couple of ways of doing that. We can click this tool here, this icon here. We can make a duplicate of that instance, which will keep our settings that we've just adjusted, or we can make an entirely new, fresh instance. The quicker way of doing a new instance, which is probably what we want to do most of the time, is simply to right click the icon. And now we have another one that's called it by default Contrast Equalizer 2. I'm going to rename this now to Texture, because that's what we're going for. I'll zoom back out. So you can see that because we've made a new instance, it's resized our area of influence back to the default. And for something roughly analogous to the texture slider in Lightroom, what we need to do is raise the left and right hand side of these curves about the same amount. So if I lift up here and lift up here and zoom back out, you can see how that's enhanced the texture. Now this end, you can see where it says fine here, as it suggests enhances the kind of the texture and fine details. So quite often you'll probably want to use that end slightly higher than this end, especially when you've got an image like this with kind of fine branches in there. So again, you can always completely overcook it, but no, that's pretty good. I can roll my mouse wheel smaller if I want to make a more isolated adjustment. Let's roll it off. There we go, just adding a little pop. Okay, it's about at this point in Lightroom that you go down to the next modules, the next controls, and start doing some color grading. As always with Darktable, there's a few ways of doing that. We've already have an instance of color balance RGB, and we've used the master tab here to adjust overall contrast. But there is another tab which is called 4 ways. And here we can do some basic kind of split toning, if you like. You see how we can adjust the hue, chroma, so the saturation in the shadows, the highlights, and power, which is midtones. So this is how we could do some basic large-scale split toning. So I often like to add a little coolness to my shadows, especially on an image like this with lots of oranges and yellows. A little cool blue contrast in the shadows often helps. So I'll select my hue here, and I'll increase my chroma here. Again, you can go completely off the wall, but generally a few percent is where you want to be. And our adjustment here is kind of turning off all the contrast adjustments as well. But we can just see a subtle blueness to the shadows there that works quite well. So that's one way of doing split toning and color grading. A more powerful way that's quite a new module is called the color equalizer. And in this we have 3 different tabs, hue, saturation and brightness. And naturally that affects the color, how strong the color is and how bright the color is for any given point. And we can use this to adjust colors in our image with quite fine results. So let's, for example, say that I want to make this tree here, which is a little bit kind of orange. I want to make it even more orange. I can select a color by going to this dropper and clicking on the color I want. And you can see this kind of target here. And back in our control, that's put a line on the graph that we can use as a reference point. We can also click Control on this eyedropper and drag a box, and that will give us a range of colors. I drag that wider, and I'll go back here. Now in our tree itself, there's quite a fine, quite a narrow range of colors. So that's about analogous to our point. So I'm on the hue tab here. So any change I make to this point is going to change the color. Now we can see that this line it's given us is actually slightly off this point. We can fine tune that with the node placement slider here. And you can see how those nodes are moving along. So we can line up that point very accurately on the chosen color. So I can drag this down and you can see how we're changing basically all the tones of that value to what's obviously a very artificial looking pink. So as with any adjustment, it's all about small and fine adjustments. So we can shift this towards kind of yellows. We can shift it more towards reds. If we just want to keep the color the same but increase the saturation, we can go to the saturation tab and increase it, or we can decrease it if we want a more muted look. Okay, let's go a little bit more saturation to it and maybe a little bit more brightness. Okay. Okay, it's about this point in Lightroom that you'll be looking at sharpening. You'll be on the Detail tab. Again, there's a few ways you can do that in Darktable. There's a high pass filter, but there's again a more powerful module for this kind of thing called Diffuse and Sharpen. It can do both. It can diffuse the image, so blur it in other words, for haze effects, or you can use it for sharpening. Now, it's quite a complicated module, and the makers of Darktable kind of recognize that, so they've actually provided quite a broad range of presets. So a lot of modules have presets, some have none, some have quite a few, and you can access them just by right-clicking the module bar, if you like. So you can see for this module we have lots of presets, including bloom, dehaze, various different sharpnesses, things like simulating watercolors, which are more kind of demonstrations, local contrast, and all that kind of thing. This is the module I normally use for sharpening, and I normally use one of these 3 lens deblur presets. So soft, medium, or hard, depending on how much sharpening I think the image needs. This is already pretty sharp, kind of well within the comfort levels of my lens at f8, 44mm. So not pushing the lens too hard. So it's nicely sharp as it is. So I'll just go for lens deblur soft. Now it's quite a CPU intensive process. So depending on how powerful your system is, this can take a little while. Mine's not too bad, but it's not great. I haven't got a great GPU. Now, in Lightroom, when you've sharpened, you have the very handy masking slider that just limits the sharpening to where you want it. And this leads me to one of Darktable's most powerful features, which is the fact that pretty much every module can be masked. At the bottom of each module, you'll see a row of icons, the same for each one, which are the various masks you can apply to that module. Lightroom has only really just introduced this in the last kind of maybe couple of years. Darktable's had it for quite a long time, and the masking tools are very powerful. You can do some quite fine selections very quickly. And I'll use the example of sharpening masking, where we don't particularly maybe want to add sharpening to the mist and the water down here. And I'll mask off just our detailed area. Before I do that, I'll just touch briefly on the masking options that we have. So the first option we have is uniform masking, which, as the name suggests, masks the whole image uniformly across the whole image at once. And that's mainly useful for just adjusting the opacity of the whole layer, if you like, the whole module, to make for more subtle effects. We have drawn masks, which are similar to Lightroom's drawn masks. We can have circles, ellipses, we can draw paths, something that Lightroom can't do, brushes, much like Lightroom, and gradients, also like Lightroom. We can use parametric masks, which are very powerful, and as the name suggests, these use a parameter of the image. For example, its brightness values, its saturation, particular colors, to select or deselect parts of the image to affect only what we want. And then we can also combine those last two. We can have a drawn and parametric mask in combination, which means that we can perhaps mask a parameter and then define an area where we don't want it to apply, or we definitely do want it to apply, in combination with those two. So this is the most powerful, but perhaps the most complicated, although it's not terrible, of the whole lot. And then finally we have raster mask, which essentially lets us reuse another mask that we've drawn elsewhere. Okay, so before we mask off this sharpening, I'm actually going to essentially reduce the effect of the sharpening so that it doesn't completely kill my processor every time I add a mask. So I'm going to go to the iterations slider here and just turn that down to 1. So it's effectively not doing anything, and it's not recomputing every time we change the mask. And in this particular image, I think we've got enough difference in parameters, brightness, saturation, and so on, that we can just use a parametric mask to select the area we want to sharpen, which is this bit in the middle. So let's scroll down to our parametric mask button, which is down here, turn that on. And now we want to visualize the mask so we can see what we're selecting. We do that by clicking this button here, and you'll see that our whole image changes to yellow. Yellow is showing what's selected, so at the moment everything is selected. And we want to, first of all, deselect the brightest part of the image, which is our sky up here and the reflection down here. So we can grab this slider here, which is the value slider, and start to remove the brighter tones from the selection. So you can see that as we hit the trees here, which are darker, they're remaining selected. We'll keep on going, and now that we can see down here that the reflection is starting to be deselected, so we'll keep on dragging. And we want to drag until everything we want is deselected. Now that we can see here, for example, that our trees are starting to be deselected. They're falling into the values that are being deselected. So now what we want to do is get this bottom half of the slider and drag it back. And you'll see that we're kind of feathering, if you like. It's not quite feathering, it's kind of transitioning between the values that are being selected. So it gives a more natural result. We can still adjust the top one. I'm not too worried about this bottom area being sharpened. There is some detail there, that's fine. So we'll make sure that we're getting those trees mostly selected. And yeah, that's fine. Now you can see that within our mask, because we've just used brightness values, we are not selecting the brighter parts of the trees, because this is where the sun's hitting those trees. So these grey areas here are not being selected. So we can use another parameter in conjunction with the brightness to make sure that these are selected as well. Before I do that, I'm going to switch my combine masks mode here to inclusive from exclusive. So anything any extra masking I add is going to be included in the mask. And I'm going to go to my CZ channel here, CZ if you're British. And this allows us to select based on saturation. So I'll just turn my preview off. And I'll zoom back out. And if I hit the C key again, so the purple areas here are more saturated, the paler areas are not saturated. So you can see, because of the sunlight falling on those colourful trees, the areas that are deselected by brightness will be selected by high saturation. So we can make use of that by combining these two parameters. Let me turn off my preview there and pop the actual mask preview back on. So I'm going to drag again the right hand slider down, and we can see that in the mask here, for example, we can see that we are selecting those more saturated colors, and we will probably come to a point where we start to get into the desaturated areas of the sky even. We don't want that. We're going to drag these back. That is pretty good. We don't have to worry too much about kind of softening off or transitioning this value. I don't think we're fine. So now you can see we've selected that whole area quite nicely. Now we do want a slightly more natural transition between the selected and the deselected. So for that we can use the feathering controls. So I will go down to feathering radius here and just increase that to say 50 pixels. You can see how that softens the edge of the mask. Okay. So now if we turn off our mask preview, we are now just applying the sharpening to the trees. Now I turned the iterations down, so we're not actually doing much sharpening at the moment. Let's go back to our iterations value here. And if you ever want to type in an exact value into Darktable, you can do that by right clicking, and then you can just type. So I'll type in 8 to go back to our preset value, press enter, and it will sharpen just the area that we've selected. Okay, so sharpening isn't perhaps the clearest example of how the masking actually affects the image. So let's do another example using exposure, and we can adjust the brightness of these areas. So I'll right click to make a new instance of the exposure module and grab a parametric mask again. And we will turn on our preview. And this time we want to select the sky and not select the center. So we'll affect the brightness of the sky and the reflection. So we'll go from the other end, we'll drag up this way. And now you can see we're deselecting the darker areas. We're starting to deselect here. So we'll drag it back. There we go. Okay, so we don't want to select these trees. We don't want to affect the brightness of these trees. We're just selecting the sky. So we'll remain this time in exclusive mode because we don't want to, we want to remove from the mask. We'll go to our saturation tab, if you like, our CZ channel, chroma channel, and then we can drag down the most saturated values, and you can see how they're starting to disappear from the center part of the image where our saturation is. We're starting to lose the sky a little bit, so we'll drag back. There we go. Ever so slightly. There we go. And then we'll feather it. A nice soft transition. Blur it as well. And we'll turn our preview off. Okay, so now when we make our adjustment, we should find that we're just affecting, whoops, the mask has come back on, I double clicked. We're just affecting the area we've selected. So we're brightening up that area quite a lot. My diffusion sharpen is slowing things down, as I mentioned it would do. So I'll just pop that module off for now. We'll turn it back on afterwards. Normally, if I wasn't following a strict Lightroom kind of workflow, then I would do the sharpening absolutely last. I was following along. So there we go. We should be able to see a little bit clearer now what's going on. So you can see we're really brightening the sky and the reflection, but we're not affecting this at all because we've deselected it. No, I obviously don't want to brighten it that much. I can also darken it significantly. That really shows where the mask is being applied. But let's pull that back up. So let's say we just want to brighten it just a touch, just for that kind of bright morning mist effect. There we go. That works quite well. And we can view the mask at any time by clicking on it's the same icon as the preview here. We can turn that off and on from the module tab itself. So that's just a taste of what you can do with the masking in Darktable. Now at this point in Lightroom, you're probably in the lens correction tab, which is quite low down the list. Normally in Darktable, it's one of the things I apply first. There's a dedicated lens correction module. So I'll just search for that here, lens correction. And it has a fairly extensive database of lenses that most of the time, unless you're using something really obscure, it will be able to find. So it's found my Fujifilm 18-55 very quickly and applied the adjustments. You can choose which of the corrections it applies. So if you're not particularly bothered by the distortion, but you are bothered by the vignetting, you can just select which of those corrections it applies. You can remove only the vignetting, keep the distortion, for example, or you can have everything to you entirely. And then we are into the effects panel, where we can add vignetting and grain. So vignetting is possible, of course, in Darktable. There are a couple of ways of doing it. There is a dedicated vignetting module, which will do a pretty good job. But the way I prefer to do it these days is actually to use yet another exposure module. So I will a couple of extra copies here from where I was testing things out. I'll turn one on, just make sure it's reset to the defaults, which is this little icon here. And we'll use a drawn mask this time to define where our vignette goes. So most of the time, obviously, a vignette is in the corners of the image. So we can do that very easily with a drawn ellipse. So we'll click the drawn mask button here. We'll click the add ellipse, and here's an ellipse. So what we have here is the area of effect, and then this dotted line is the kind of the fall off. And with an ellipse mask, we can either click a point and drag in and out, or we can hold shift and roll the mouse wheel to change the feather like that. You can drag handles here to change the shape and size of the ellipse. So I want a kind of a very elliptical ellipse, if you want, something kind of narrow like that to conform to the shape of our photo. So let's do that. And now if I click the mask preview, that we'll see by default we're actually selecting inside this ellipse. We don't want that. Naturally, for a vignette, we want to select this area here. So we can just flip the polarity of that mask with this button here. So we'll click that, and out it comes. Okay, so now we can position a little more finely. Let's go there, maybe slightly fatter. There we go. Turn off our preview, and then we can drop our exposure, see how we look. If I go way too much, you can really see the effect. It's quite stark. We can feather it like this as well, which kind of feathers inside more, or we can roll that out to control the fall off of the effect. So let's use a more subtle tone. And as ever, we can turn it off and on, off and on. Pretty good. Maybe a touch more to make it more obvious. Okay. And if you ever want to keep the module on but not see the shape of the mask, you can click this button here, which turns off the shape but still keeps the module on, so you can adjust without the distraction of those lines on there as well. And the other effect in the effects panel in Lightroom is grain. There is a dedicated grain module. I don't use it that often, but if you want to use it, it's there. And the controls are fairly self-explanatory. And you can see how it's adding grain to this shot. How coarse it is, how strong it is, and how biased towards midtones the grain effect is. I'm not going to put it on for this particular image. It's there if you need it. So now it's just a matter of finishing touches. I'm going to turn my sharpening back on. So let me find the diffuse and sharpen module again. There we go. And our mask is still in place, even though we turn the module off. Just sharpening where we want it. And one final thing I like to do with most of my images is add a frame. So I'll pop a frame on and use my preset of 5% white. So adding presets is very easy in Darktable. Make your change. So let's say I want, in fact, a 10% border or 15%, say. Right click, I can pop in 15, press enter, and then I can click here, click store new preset. I can call this 15% white. Click OK. And now it's available when I right click, choose a 5% white, 15% white, whatever I like. And I can even update a preset that's existing as well if I want to. Now, if you want to do a kind of a before and after on an image, that's pretty easy to do as well. I'm going to turn off my frame for this particular point because it doesn't kind of handle it particularly well. So I'm going to close this set of controls on the right with this arrow here, go over to my left controls here, and you can see that we've got the history stack of all the adjustments we've made to the image. And you can go back at any point and see what the image was like before. Okay, so this is essentially the first, that's the default Sigmoid has been added by default by Darktable for tone mapping. And then we started to add our own, so exposure, Sigmoid adjustments and so on. And then we can go back by clicking back on the higher steps. And in order to do a before and after, you can simply click take snapshot at any point in the history. So we've taken a snapshot, essentially the last step, while we turned our frame on. Then we can go back to any given step. So at this point, I'll go back to just the default tone mapping, and then we'll go back to the top and click our snapshot. And Darktable gives us this slider in the middle of the image that we can drag from side to side to preview our changes. So we're getting some change in kind of geometry, if you like, from the lens correction being applied. But it gives you a good sense of the changes, and if you want to have it vertical instead of horizontal, you can do it that way as well by clicking that little rotation arrow as well. Okay, so there's our finished image for this one. Much longer video than I normally do, but I have gone into more depth with most of the tools. So I hope you enjoyed this one. If you did, like and subscribe for more Darktable workflows and tips, tricks, and everything else. And I will catch you on the next one.